Wow, that's pretty incredible. I'm not sure where you pulled all these people, which rabbit you pulled out of a hat, Annabelle, but Dr. Gillian Farmer was pretty impressive. So, universal health coverage, a concept endorsed by WHO and UN, and how do we make sure that we're moving towards that, at least in our remote communities, is a question for us. Just before we go into the next panel of incredible people, I've just got a really boring announcement. Deb Spanner, Tawanda Makaringara, and Christopher Keepy, sorry that I have butchered your last names, can you please go and see Judy at the registration desk at some stage after, like at morning tea, because she's got some questions for you. All right, now we're moving from Dr. Farmer through to another group of amazing national experts that Annabelle has pulled together. The panellists that we're going to be listening to now are truly experts once again in their specialties on a national stage. So I'd like to ask Frank Quinlan to come on up, Professor Sabina Knight, Dr. Dan Halliday and Dr. Sarah Renwick Lau, Senator Susan McDonald and Nikki Thompson. So it is a bit of a cast of thousands, but we had so many amazing people and we needed to rejuggle the timetable, as Annabelle said. So this is how we've got you access to this incredible wisdom in one place. So this panel, what does quality accessible primary health care look like and how do we fund and develop appropriate models for remote Australia, is a perfect segue to Dr. Farmer. As I said to you last night, we're not doing full bios for these incredible people, but if you want to Google them, there'll be tons on them on the World Wide Web, and their names are on the program if you want to follow up and do that later. So the format we'll use is the same as last night, where we'll give you all some questions, and then hopefully there's a bit of a conversation between you, and we'll throw then to questions from the floor. So I'll start with you, Frank. You all saw Frank earlier. He was one of the RFDS people, so he's had a warm glow early this morning at their awesomeness. So you've spent most of your life in Canberra advocating for the rural health sector, Frank. Currently, you're the Federation Executive Director for RFDS Australia. How do you see RFDS service delivery evolving in the primary healthcare space?
Yeah, look, thank you, and thanks very much to Annabelle and the organisers for getting all of this together. I was brought here on false pretences because Annabelle said I was here to listen, and yet here I am with a microphone in my hand. We have a saying in Canberra that says no data without stories and no stories without data. And I think it's a good way of approaching advocacy. And I wanted to tell you a brief story about yesterday, quickly tell you about today, and then reflect a little bit on tomorrow. So going way back, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, which is very much known for swoop and scoop style activities, or as I heard, lift and shift in that previous presentation. One of our founding stories about a stockman, Jimmy Darcy, who fell off his horse and essentially required bladder surgery that was performed by the local postmaster with a pocket knife, and Morse code instructions being received from a doctor that was 3,000 kilometres away. So I say that story because telehealth was at the very beginning, and I think remains part of our journey today. Fast forward to today, and as I sat next to Russell Postle, our chair of our Queensland section and National Director of the Federation Board, there were 12 aircraft in the air, literally. You can Google that any time you like, it's better than Googling me. Google the RFDS live flight map and you'll see what our folks are doing all the time. And now, in a typical day, there might be something like 300 medical transfers, rough numbers, 300 medical transfers. They'll often be into hospital transfers or responses to emergencies. But what's less known is that there'll be 1,000 people who will receive some form of primary health care through a clinic, a GP clinic, a nurse clinic, dental clinics, mental health clinics, and other things. So that's the less known side of the flying doctor service, but a lot of what we do is fundamental. As we heard in Ruth's presentation earlier, it doesn't take a health economist to work out that it's cheaper to prevent people from becoming ill or to intervene early in their illness than it is to retrieve them with an aeromedical evacuation. Starting to point to tomorrow, just briefly, and there's some great examples right here in Queensland. Russell again reminded me of the Ride West program, which raises funds from the community, literally community people raising money, north of $500,000 a year, I think, Russell, which then funds a program called Wellbeing Out West, which is an RFDS program that encounters people where they are and how they are at field days and other events, and inquires not just about their physical health but their mental health as well. And I think really that is the sort of model of, if I look to the future, of where the RFDS is heading in its space. The RFDS will initiate and lead a lot of that work, but it will also be a partner to the sorts of organisations that you're all coming from as well. So just like the postmaster received Morse code instructions, I don't think we're going to entrust too many postmasters with bladder surgery, but programs like Wellbeing Out West can empower local workers, local community members to intervene in relation to mental health and other activities. And I think as we look to the future, it's that expansion of integrated primary health care that takes the whole person, that doesn't make the doctor, skip past the teeth to get to the tonsils, that, incorporates the whole person where they are, that doesn't treat mental illness as if it's something radical and different from physical illness or anything else. I'm quite sure that that's the future, and would encourage you all to partner with the likes of Joe Mann, who's here somewhere. Where are you, Joe? Thanks for putting your hand up. Joe's been in this community for 20 years. And this community has the longest running RFDS base at 80 years. So there's a lot of continuity of service in that program, but I'd encourage you to be part of it.
Thanks, Frank. I've got one more for you. Don't think you're getting...
Okay.
Oh, yes, that was very good. We have more, though. So how might others best collaborate with the RFDS, this sort of building on what you've just said, to enhance the outcomes for their remote communities? You're saying that's the model you want to move to, so what can people here do, other than talk to Joe?
Yeah, look, one of the things that I think we all encounter is that complicated mess that is healthcare. Commonwealth funding, state funding, PHN funding, program funding, charitable funding, all sorts of different streams, and a lot of the work that you're all doing and we're trying to do is to make that all that messy tapestry appear seamless to the person who walks through our door or encounters our service. I think the easiest pathway, though it's not easy, is really to engage quite directly and quite locally with the people who are on the ground. It's communities on the ground who plan services, who grow services. At the RFDS, we often consider ourselves to be a bit like a public company, because so many community members have raised funds, have rattled tins, have worked very hard to establish services that we consider that's a sort of almost a form of public ownership of our charitable organisation. It'd be talking to those local communities through PHNs in their planning processes, through the RFDS when we come and plan services, literally talking and working creative new ways of doing things. Again, Wellbeing Out West is an innovative new program because it's not reliant on government funding. It doesn't get stuck in the railway tracks that are often associated with government funding, but can lead the way in terms of establishing new programs nationally. So we can then bring the story from this local community back to Canberra and tell that story and say, look, here is a program that works, the community invented it, they're making it work, and here's something you can fund with confidence. Because there's lots of things that Canberra can fund. They're always looking to fund things that they can fund with confidence.
So no data without stories and no stories without data.
Yes.
Wonderful. Sabina. So thank you, Frank. That's fantastic. So we've got Professor Sabina Knight, who most of you, or lots of you will know. So she spent many years working in remote health as a RAN in Central Australia, and you're currently the Director of JCU's Murtapuni Centre for Rural and Remote Health, and you've moved to Emerald now from Mount Isa, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I've left Murtapuni in the capable hands of Associate Professor Katrina Felton-Bush, and I'm setting up a new University Department of Rural Health in Emerald.
Which is so exciting, and that's what
yeah.
everyone was talking about last night, about getting doctors trained and or health people trained.
No, getting
in
health
local,
professionals.
health
We're focused on the lot.
in local communities because they stay. Yeah. So not that that's your question. What do you consider the most effective and efficient role for nurses in the delivery of appropriate primary health care going forward?
Well, nurses have been the background of the primary health care or access to any health services in very remote Australia. For those of you who live in very remote Australia, you know that by definition is your only access has been through a nurse-led clinic or an Aboriginal health worker-led clinic. So that is the difference. And that has been Australia's tradition. We are celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of CRANA, the Council of Remote Area Nurses of Australia, where we came together in Alice Springs to try and work out how together we could raise the quality of care in very remote Australia. We were all very concerned about it. And in fact, in that time, because there were no phones or faxes, we all thought our own experience, personal experience, was unique, not something that was common across remote Australia. So organised healthcare through regional Aboriginal community control services in very remote Australia and nurse-led clinics, either in the community control sector or the state sector, is what we have. Roughly 375 odd remote clinics across Australia. But just as we spoke last night about it's not good enough just to have a doctor or it's not good enough just to have a nurse, you want someone who's got the skills you need to provide the service that you need in the context of the community and your family of where you are. So we think about what they do. They provide care across the lifespan. They're true generalists. Care across the lifespan, acute care, chronic care, public health, population health. In their provide a lot of on-call. They're very small teams. And so what we end up with is quite a bit of churn. But one of our failings in Australia has been to address the support of developing the skill sets that we need in an organised way. So we've got amazing people who put their hand up to work in remote health, but we don't support them to develop the skills they need and to be able to have longevity in that practice. Because of the on-call raising the demands, your life expectancy in this area is quite short, but we need to be able to support people to be able to do this care over a longer period of time, because it's the relationships of trust. It's understanding your communities, understanding the population health, public health issues of that community that allows you to provide some of the important elements of care that Michael was talking about last night. Our communities and people absolutely demand of us and expect of us to be health promoting clinicians, that they want us to have the hard conversations. They want us to be able to work with them to not only deal with the sprained knee or the bulgur or whatever it is that's happened today, but to also do the screening and early detection of those really important conditions that impact our lives and then our family lives. And we can see the failure in not doing that by all the clinicians who work in very remote Australia, because we've got rising rates of conditions that just shouldn't be there. Now, there are things that relate specifically to the other social determinants of health, not just access to quality healthcare, but the housing, overcrowding in housing that results in conditions like rheumatic heart disease and other conditions, access to quality nutrition at important times of life, particularly in the early years and in prenatal times, that impacts on people's entire trajectory in their life. We know that all the dials are set for chronic disease in utero, so there's a real opportunity for us to make a difference here. If we're not paying attention to that, then we are determining in the negative someone's life opportunities. So we've got fabulous opportunities to upskill who we've got and who would choose to work in remote Australia and very remote Australia. Nurses, Aboriginal health workers, Torres Strait Islander health workers, allied health professionals and doctors, to make sure they've got the skill sets to be able to deal with those clinically significant conditions they might not encounter in other places.
So I've just got a question there. How do we support
See, as a clinician and consumer in remote and rural health for a number of years, I've known perspectives on this. But what I've seen over time is that what quality accessible healthcare is actually you in the room. And so we know that remote and rural people aren't whingers. We know that as consumers in this space are realistic in terms of the care that you expect. And you're aware of your surroundings around you. In so much like our clinicians, we're aware of the resources that we have to actually provide the best care that we can to you when you need it. Empower the medical professionals to actually provide the care that they need to provide for you, but also having medical background as support within our remote and rural communities, whether it's physically, face-to-face, or via increasingly telehealth, actually provides the right care at the right time, the person with the right skills to provide that care. So the way that we actually envisage care is changing, I think, but we need to look at the resourcing associated with that. And it needs to be community-based, appropriate co-design, and actually recognising the needs of the community. So I think that's some of the concepts that we are trying to incorporate within the development of the National Rural Generalist model that's coming out. Obviously, the medical context of that is actually really well advanced, but also acknowledging Sabina's comments that nursing and the development of the nursing generalist framework is actually a really key point going forward, and that needs to be extended into allied health, and how that actually, and then all of those models of healthcare then combine. So it's a little bit sort of complex, but in saying that though, it's a complex system, but we actually need to start to look at how we put all of those together to make sure that it develops those accessible models that remote and rural people can actually access.
Thanks, Dan. So you've just talked about what you think the models look like. How do you think communities can go about developing an appropriate model for them? So we've heard the Mallacoota model, we've heard the Port Hedland model. They were both, community driven, and in fact Mallacoota's community owned in some ways.
I think so, and referencing Sarah's work as well. So there's, from my take on it as an external person outside of that community, there was a period of reflection, obviously evaluation of the service process and everything that goes with it. And a lot of co-design and community engagement. So there's a lot. So, and talk about Frank's comments about, the thing is you actually need to have the data, and the stories to go with it. So it needs to be robust in terms of the way that you actually develop those models of care. And there's a significant disparity in funding, within our broader health landscape at the moment, and in terms of our teaching, training and research funding as well. So we talk about the interface between the state and federal funding divide. There is no accountability for how the federal government's funding for the states in terms of their teaching and training and research funding goes to the states, and how they are held accountable for that portion of funding being provided to remote and rural areas. There is no key accountability, outcome accountability for how they spend that money. And you as community members don't recognise that, don't realise that. No one tells you this. The fact that less than 3% of the Health and Research Council funding for the country goes to remote and rural areas. So you've got 30% of the population receiving 3% of the health research funding. How is that equitable? Yeah, so with the highest health needs, in Australia, you get 3%. And that's not remote, that's rural and remote. So how is that justifiable? And I think to actually bring all of that together, I congratulate you, the organisers of this conference, and hopefully it can actually start to generate the discussion, because it comes down to community to actually determine the models of care that you need. And I think that's the real powerful position that you have today, to actually go back to your communities and actually look at, well, this is the funding disparity. How do we actually then translate that into recognising what our community needs and actually fighting for the funds? Because there's a lot of power bases, entrenched power bases, with major metropolitan areas and in other entrenched systems, which makes it very hard to actually get that funding. So, so I think you actually have to also have a political and an organisational will, and you have to give credit to your elected members who are actually in the room today, because you know the thing is to actually to come all the way to Charleville and actually to hear what communities want for their models of care actually shows a commitment. And as Annabelle's pointed out, there is a number of representatives that actually aren't in the room. So again, sort of reinforcing that process to say, hey, you know, we are here, we have a voice, and you know, and that voice that shouldn't be, you know, used lightly, obviously, given the broader context of what that means nationally at the moment. But to actually recognise the fact that to provide the opportunity for, I think, a Charleville consensus or whatever comes out of this conference, to actually recognise that a universal model of care, a standard of care that supports remote communities is an imperative. And that will feed into organisations like ACRM, RACGP, acknowledging my colleague Michael Clements and others in the room, to ensure that that can also be fed through in our language when we're dealing with people in Canberra and Brisbane and other centres of power. Thank
you. All right, thank you. I'm still reeling over 3% of the funding going to 30% of the population. So they're pretty confronting numbers. So, Sarah, we've heard from Dr. Sarah Renwick-Lau last night. So you spoke about your experience at Mallacoota and the delivery of equitable health outcomes, stating that remote areas need GPs and communities need flexible support so they can attract and retain them. I've got a question for you before I go on to Annabelle's questions. Sorry, Annabelle, I'm probably sacked now, but listening to what Dan's just said, how did you work politically at Mallacoota? How did you work with politicians? Because, you know, you've over time, the significant funding has come to you, and we know that stories and data and stories are important, but how did you work politically?
I guess firstly what I would say is that Robin Bryant, who was a member of our community who I approached, he has long experience as a public servant, and he's a political machine. So I was just joking with my community member, we should just hire him out at consultancy rates and use that to fund our health services. But, you know, I think... but I guess what I would also like to say is that we still, this many years on, I would say have zero traction with state health in Victoria. So the state health department, we would have no traction at all, with huge amounts of lobbying. So our way around, I think we worked very politically, and we spoke to a lot of people, but we only found a few people who could hear us and listen to us. And we also realised that we had to, if we were going to find a solution, that we needed to do it ourselves. So, you know, I think, you know, the success of the RFDS in being able to support remote communities is because, yeah, they're not bound by, you know, specific government funding streams, or they, you know, yeah, probably do, but you know, they do have access to philanthropy. So philanthropy has been a really big part of how you make things work in remote communities. I think it always has. When something works, it's often because there's someone in the background supporting. So I think we worked politically, but I don't think we've had a lot of success actually in that regard.
So Susan's writing notes. Good. Excellent strategy, Susan, because you're next. So Sarah, people sitting here in the room going, oh my gosh, we've seen those inspiring models. We've heard from all these amazing influencers. We know that everyone's sort of on the same track here. What do I do? When I go home tomorrow, what do I do? What have you learnt from your process but you'd say what are the top 3 tips you'd give people?
3, okay.
Or you
There's
can go
so
5.
many.
I'm
No,
not super strict about it.
There's so much going through my head. I think, and yeah, this is about what you can do in your community because I think what happens for remote areas is we get kind of tacked onto rural, and that trickle down just gets us absolutely nowhere. So as a remote community, you have to recognise what are your strengths as a remote community, particularly when it comes to recruitment and retention. And I think that's a strength because you can connect with people a little bit more closely. So I guess I would say, firstly, the easy entry, gracious exit model for private GPs is very appealing. GPs do like their autonomy, but when there's market failure, and there is always market failure in remote communities, a GP should be able to ply their trade even though there's market failure when they're providing essential services in a community. So ask the question, what can we as a community do to support private GPs in the obvious market failure? I think it's worth understanding that GPs who work in small communities are also, we're really at the whim of members who sit on local boards. I think for a GP to be successful in a remote community, they need communities to see the value and see them as a commodity. And it doesn't matter if you've got different values around climate change or you think that GP is a bit of a prima donna. Maybe it's just because they know what their needs are. The GP is the key to your, the quality of healthcare. And I guess, Stan has had a lot of experience with Victorian GPs, rural GPs, and he would know how many communities have cut off their nose to spite their faces because there's just a little thing that a GP needs to be able to maintain their longevity. And there's, a couple of people on the board, the local health board, who are just like, no, they don't, they already have too much money and they don't need a fence. Why should we buy a fence for that person? So, I think that kind of attitude sees a lot of doctors leaving communities. In a small remote town, the GP will generally be the most senior clinician in that town. But I think even being a senior clinician, we don't always have a seat at the table when it comes to health decisions and impacting on the community. And communities can do a lot to advocate for the messages that their doctors are giving back to them. So when we often see the health needs because that's what we're doing day in, day out. I see 10% of my community's population every week. So, we have reach into the community. But if we go down the line and talk about those needs, we don't often have any traction. So, for the community to be able to hear those things and take that down the line, I think is really, really useful. And look, I guess in terms of workforce, which is obviously the big question, it's kind of easy. I think if you are presented with a person in your community who has the skills, is a health professional, and they want to put their passion for their work in your community, what is the first question that you're going to ask that person? And the first question is going to be, what do you need? What do you need to make what is your dream role? What's your dream life? How can we help you achieve that in our community? It's just about asking the question. And we use that now, in a place where recruiting health professionals is so difficult, but when someone turns up and they're looking around or we meet them, the first question we ask is, what are you looking for? What's going to work for you? And then we use our flexibility within, I guess having that charity in the background, which is the community, having that in the background, they've got the means to be able to say, okay, what is it that we can do to support you for what you're looking for? But I think you also need to be aware that a lot of health professionals, as Sabina was saying, some of them do know how to look after themselves, but I don't think that necessarily needs to be by flying in and flying out. but a lot of health professionals don't know how to look after themselves. And so it's up to us as health professionals to know what it is that we need to maintain our capacity, and so that so communities can ask us, what's your capacity? Are you within it? If you're working outside of your capacity, that's burnout. So, what can we do to help keep you in that? If there's less than 6 people on a first on-call roster, don't fool yourselves. The people on that roster, if there's less than 6, are going to get burnt out, and they're going to leave your community. So don't demand a first on-call roster with less than 6 people on it. I think you've just got to be realistic and raise your expectations of what quality of life you want for your health professionals in your community.
So that ties in a bit with ties in directly with one of Megan's statements last night about it's not just the GP, it's their partner and their children as well. So the example about you leaving that town because of the fence, because of the dogs, would tie in with that. And I was thinking, there's so much expertise in this audience. If something's raising a question for you, have a look at the name badges in the breaks, because I was on the plane with Dr. Rimmer yesterday and he was talking about a model they're using in the Central West to get young doctors, train them, keep them, that's slightly different. It's not that private model. So he'd be someone to hit up if you're interested in different models that are working as well. Thank you so much, Sarah. And these guys are going to be ready and waiting for your questions. Thank you so much. Now, Senator Susan McDonald, thank you so much. Thank you for coming when you got the invitation. You're the first off the rank. And thank you for being up here with our other experts. Obviously, I'm really keen to understand about how to build relationships. But first of all, first let's just start there. So there's been lots of conversation. How do these communities build relationships with politicians? How do they play politically, when they start to think about what the model is? And is it, how are they proactive? All those things that you understand intimately.
Thank you, and I am absolutely delighted to be here, not least because Annabelle said this is the event and this is the date, and I said I'll see you there.
And would you be game not to turn up?
Absolutely not. And that's why a passionate advocate is the most important thing you could have. I would just start by talking about how the world has changed and why we should care about this. So I grew up on a cattle station outside Cloncurry, and we had a GP who had been with the Allied forces in Japan post the bombings there, and he came to Cloncurry and stayed for over 50 years. And it was in the days when there was no backup. He ran the hospital practice as well as the private practice. His wife ran the reception, and that world does not exist anymore. And so that has been a real transition, particularly in Queensland, where we have this dual model of hospital and private practice. But why should we, Cato Minister for Northern Australia and regional Australia being of the population of the country, this is the same right across the place. And it's why local government is such an important level of government, because they are close to the ground, more representative by numbers than state and federal, which does drift towards the big population centres. So the population decline is really concerning, and for me, who sees that our great production from this land, in the way we think about ourselves iconically, whether it's tourism, resources, agriculture, it only happens when there are people out here. And the ICPA were represented today. They are educating their own children, being the first line of medical care in some points with an RFDS medical box, or relying on CareFlight to come in a helicopter to evacuate. These are the front line. So how do we better support allied health more broadly? And government policy is a big part of this. So we've just seen, on the 1st of July last year, the distribution priority areas that stated that any international medical graduate coming to Australia must have done 2 to 3 years in a rural setting. But from the 1st of July last year, that rural and rural setting definition was changed to include outer metro areas. And regional health really is the canary in the coal mine, isn't it? Remote health, I should say. It's a canary in the coal mine for medical care right across the country. And the second one is, I'll just give you an example of the pharmacies who've just ran a very effective campaign. We have 342 postcodes in Australia where there is no GP. There is a pharmacist is the front line of defence, in addition to nurses and other allied health workers. I mean, this is a tragedy for so much of the country, and so political settings are incredibly important. The community strength and working together and having a singular voice and a singular message is critical. And so I'd just like to quickly just say Anne Ruston is the Shadow Minister for Health and comes out of regional South Australia. She talks about state and federal health systems being competitive, not complementary. That the number of service providers into regional areas are not coordinated. So it's not, and I think we've heard this a few times, it's not about more dollars, it's about better coordination of the dollars that are spent. The patient outcomes, which we've also heard, should be a KPI. She asks, are settings hindering quick adoption of new and innovative technology? Is largely activity-based funding stifling innovation care models? And is this the most effective way of spending the significant amount of funds that we spend in health but are not necessarily hitting the ground? So, yeah, I'll wrap it up there. I think that medicine, medical care, healthcare in remote areas is critical, but it is also reflective of why people are not staying regionally, because they look at our education system, our health system, the lack of spending on roads, the inaffordable health airfares. There is a whole lot of layering, which means that people who have the choice leave, and people who don't have the choice, people on stations, in Indigenous communities, they're the ones who are here. And we have to do more to build those populations, build capacity, and support those communities, and hopefully rebuild population. Thank you.
Okay, Nikki, lucky last. So, Nikki, you're here as a community member, but you also have a strong allied health background. So you always see things from a different and multi-lensed perspective. And as a community representative on the panel, and albeit one with a vast experience in delivery of physiotherapy and associated allied health services, what do you see as the 3 key elements that will show the community has branded its ownership on the changes it drives moving forward?
Thanks very much. And thank you, Annabelle, for creating this space, and Jude and the rest of the team, because I think this is so vital. And I look out as a community member, and what I see in front of me is a really healthy ecosystem and an ecology of people. And that's something that I would sense we would see in a community when there has been a change, because at the moment, I don't think we're looking at health through the right lens at all. To me, health should be a reflector of being in right relationship with the land, with each other, with life in general. I think we've gone through this space of being very industrialised, and we've sliced and diced everything, we've put it into boxes. We've learned an awful lot by that. I don't want to belittle it, but the challenges nowadays to me are how do we put it back together? And how do we put it back together using natural intelligence, rather than trying to superimpose these top-down models that have already been sliced and diced. It's come up before. We have 3 tiers of government. Health can get thrown as a hot potato between the different levels of government. Yet on the ground, that's where there's a knowingness. And I see rural and remote areas, so I've got to make sure I'm not going off point here at the moment. Really, there's a whole lot of skills here that maybe we've forgotten that we've got. And to go back to that connection with natural intelligence that's in all of us and that we're surrounded by, because the systems we've created have externalised that. And excuse the French, but the multiple shits that we're sitting in are coming because of that. We've ignored the things that we haven't wanted to see, and they're coming back to bite us in all spaces. And health is going to be, to me, the thing that is going to be the indicator of that. So if we can start to get some models that are working with the natural intelligence of individuals working in community and seeing that as a relational concept, I think we will start to shift the system from the grassroots up.
So could you give us a practical example of what that might look like?
Well, I look at it particularly in smaller communities where people know each other and there's not this big divide between the health system, the education system, the transport system, the da-da-da-da-da. People know each other. You know, you can walk down the street and you can see the local principal. You can see the postmaster who might have done the bladder surgery decades ago. There are all the pieces are here and we know them, and we know the people who know how to make things happening. Whereas you get into bigger communities, we often use those divisions as a way to avoid things, I think. And so to me, we can start to look at health as not just what's happening in the hospital or the GP practices or the allied health practices, but what's happening in the school, what's happening with our communication systems, what's happening with the roads around us, what's happening in the communities, what's happening in the families. People in remote areas know that, but I think we've been disempowered from thinking we can actually do anything about it. And I look at the moment politically, you know, we've had Sophie Howe out from Wales, who was the Minister for Future Wellbeing, and we're starting to get concepts of having a wellbeing budget. A rural area could be a beautiful spot to do that. You know, give some block funding that goes over a decent length of time that people can work together to make that happen without having to spend half their time filling in paperwork to justify the pittance of money they've got, that they knew full well they could have made it work better if they could have spoken with them and we could go round that boundary and just, because that happens, that's what happens when things work. People work with what they've got and they trust themselves. They don't see themselves as a victim to the system, but they see themselves as empowered and natural, and it's where farming and agriculture is going back to. You know, we went down this monoculture industrialised version and it's not working well for us. And as humans, we can shift that same thinking, and it will work because it's how nature has worked since the beginning of time. It's not new.
Thanks, Nikki. So, thank you. Well, thank you. What an excellent panel. I'm sure there's some questions bubbling away down here in the audience. We've got 10 minutes before we move on out to morning tea. So if you've got a question, pop your hand up. The girls are ready to run the mics and the panel are ready and raring to go. This one's a troublemaker. Don't let him have the mic.
Good advice, Wendy. So I guess, Gus White, I'm a remote Australian Matter director and live in far western New South Wales, between Wentworth and Broken Hill. I guess my question's around the data, and the story we just listened to is all about how there's a major healthcare issue in remote Australia, from what Ruth was saying and the data she put up. From listening to the panel members, we're talking about a funding inequity, significant. You know, so there's an identified problem, and it certainly appears as though urban areas are laughing at that problem, not just discriminating. And So that's not okay. And I guess, how can we put together a better proposal to get funding out there? I've just come around via Broome at a rangeland conference. I've seen firsthand the value of keeping traditional owners on country, the value to them and their community and the landscape, as well as multi-generational landholders like myself. I've got a strong attachment to the land and to the animals. If I had to move off country, I reckon my lifespan would be pretty limited as well. So how can we put together a better proposal so they can see the cost of not investing in remote healthcare?
Grab the mic, ladies and gents.
Thanks very much, Gus. So I think there's some other entities and bodies which, can be engaged in this process as well. And the National Rural Health Alliance, I think, could be one of those entities to engage. And they've certainly done a lot of work over the years in terms of the relative value of the services provided, but also the lack of services provided to remote and rural people compared to communities in metropolitan and regional centres as well. So their latest report, and they've released a report about every 5 years or so for the last 10 or 15 years. And based on Medicare receipts alone per capita, they've identified historically, I think it was about a $2 billion underspend per year on remote and rural people back in the late 2000s. The most recent update is close to or over $6 billion a year in terms of per capita comparative Medicare underspend in remote and rural areas. And Megan might be able to correct me. She's probably across it a bit more than me, but I believe that's the case. Knowing some of the other data as well is important. We recognise in terms of the healthcare that's or the healthcare providers, obviously, providing the healthcare as well and generating those Medicare receipts. We've recognised the intent for that workforce to go forward to provide that healthcare and obviously try and address the gap. So we've also acknowledged that medical students, the 13% figure quoted, a significant figure but less figure is actually 6% of medical students, in addition to the ones that are identifying general practice, are actually identifying rural generalist medicine as a career. So for the first time, we're actually, and rural generalist medicine, of course, is specialist general practitioners who provide advanced scope of practice in one or main areas, which obviously the community needs. So the overall interest of medical students is growing slowly, but there is actually some growth there to actually try and address that gap going forward. In terms of the other funding issues as well, as I said, the state and national, the COAG Health Agreement, which is up for renewal very shortly, that's a significant part of a piece of the puzzle. So as an advocacy group, to actually get in the ears of the politicians about this process is actually going to be really key to hold the states to account for their part of the funding arrangements for that COAG Health Agreement. So, and respecting our comments previously about the teaching, training and research funding as well, to make sure that underpins that sustainable health provision within remote and rural communities. So that's just a couple of comments, hopefully, that can try and feed into that discussion.
Can I just add to that, Gus? And great to meet you in person, given that I just follow you on the device that was or the platform that was previously known as Twitter. That data cut is not generally known. So data is the power in all of this. I've been doing a lot on how we can, using an economic agency in Townsville, to cut data around spending in regional and remote places. And I would suggest that certainly the cities aren't aware of it. They would see the inequity in it, the population. And most politicians go to represent their patch. And their patch, if it's not here, It's not something that they're looking for. Well, what are we spending? What is the per capita? Is it reasonable what we're spending remotely? And so I think the biggest part is understanding what the data is, getting good data analysis, and then promoting the crackers out of it. And there is a very few journalists left regionally. There is very small voice. So that's why the singular voice is so important. That's why the work of this community across Australia, but remote Australians Matter, is providing, from this singular issues, let's find the most important priorities and go and attack that more broadly. And how do we give voice to that? Because I truly believe it's not through ill intent, most of it's through lack of knowledge.
Could I add to
Yes,
that? I think that data is incredibly important, and the understanding the spend, but also the cost of the spend. So we need to be able to match what we're spending with what the health need is. So it's all fruit, but it's not apples and apples. And we also need to understand the exchange rate. So what the dollar will buy for the health service we heard about this morning in Port Hedland is significantly different to what the dollar will buy here in Charleville. And so Australia's exchange rate across Australia, I think, is something we do need to take into account and have as a vibrant part of that conversation. And also our Medicare funding is our national system for reimbursing health costs or paying for health costs. Only for some clinicians, and so we're not even counting the spend for a great number of occasions of service that we hate to call them in very remote Australia. So we don't even know how to capture that or how much more we need. So I think that's all critical part of the mix. Communities, one of the things that they need to be asking their clinicians, asking us is, what's our health data? Like, what's our health profile? What's our population health profile? What are the emerging issues? Because when you're in it, yes, it's the old wooden trees situation. If this is our normal, then we don't see things as being unusual, or are there opportunities to fix? We have high tolerance for risk-taking behaviour. We have the highest rates of single vehicle accidents, of survivable, what should have been survivable fatalities because of lower levels of seatbelt wearing, for example, higher rates of smoking in rural women, in small rural women, small rural areas, into remote, which is surprising given the education level there. So are there things that if community knew that they would want to be able to try and address themselves with community and personal responsibility, because they would be the ones to have the conversation. But asking the clinicians and the health services for your data so that you're well informed is incredibly important.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Sarah, and then I'm going to ask your permission to run a bit late into morning tea, because I think that it's more valuable to have our questions to this panel than duck out for our scone on time. So is that okay? It's okay. Or Gus gives me thumbs up, so it's done. Okay. Sarah.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. And crazy idea, and I think Nikki touched on it. If we acknowledge that there's an underspend in remote and very remote health, so I'm talking remote, very remote. Rural health is a big problem, yes, but we're talking about remote, very remote. If there's an underspend, crazy idea, can we fund communities? Can communities be fund holders to find their own solutions? Yeah, I mean, in Mallacoota, we just needed a little bit of funds so that we could spearhead a bit of a recruitment campaign, and we just needed a few $1,000s to go to a conference. And, the local council stumped that up. The workforce agency didn't, because we were in competition with our rural workforce agency by going to a conference. And I guess the other thing is where are those funding streams? The primary health networks. Can I say something about primary health networks? Can I go for it? What's going on with primary health networks? Okay, they fund large organisations. Well, certainly our primary health network will only fund, and over the last 10 years, will fund large organisations. So where does that leave a small community organisation that requires funds to improve their primary health care when the primary health network will only commission a large organisation? Remote communities do not have large organisations in their communities by default. So, you know, we end up in these competitive grant rounds with large organisations that then put in applications to provide services in our communities and then don't provide them. And they have absolutely no, I mean, Michael touched on it with, I didn't actually realise about the states, but the primary health networks have no mandate for outcomes at all. They you know, we're in communities trying to get outcomes, and the PHNs aren't supporting us. You know, how do we stream funds into communities so that we can create our own solutions?
Which links to the conversation about healthcare being about connection and knowing your community, and when the big providers...
You can't do that from a city office. You can't
Well,
create
you were asked
solutions
to say
for the
that there
office.
was a funding model that worked quite well for small regional remote towns, the multi-purpose service funding, and many of you would be familiar with this because you would have it where all funds were pooled for that area where they combine aged care, urgent care, general practice funding in order to be able to co-design a multi-purpose service for that place. So it brought together all those elements that we've heard so far. They weren't very remote communities, but they were certainly very remote towns. I was thinking of Julia Creek as being the last one that I heard of that was commissioned. But that funding stream was frozen. Probably 10 years ago, I'd say, and that the principles of that, I think, is what we should be arguing for going forward.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I do want to mention that there is people in the audience who have lots of hats on, and so, yeah, I think absolutely we need to be open about our conversations, but I also acknowledge there'll be people in the audience going, oh God, don't go there and don't ask me questions. So I guess just be aware of that when you're at morning tea and you see their name tag, because we're here to build relationships, but absolutely be honest at the same time. So thank you so much. Now, there was other questions. Karen.
Yeah. My name is Karen Tully. I'm from Charleville. I also chair the South West Hospital and Health Board. We've heard the importance of good stories and good data. There's no shortage of that. I believe by the end of today, we'll have lots of good advocacy ideas to take to, and I'm going to direct my question to Senator McDonald. We'll have the ideas as to what we want. And I guess we'd like to go to our politicians and our decision makers with 100% good policy in mind. However, the political reality is it's at the best 50% good policy and 50% good politics. My question is, what are the sweet spots? What's the song lines for us to hit? And forget party politics, I'm just putting it into the governmental arena. What are the song lines, the sweet spots, what is it we need to do to make sure our good policies, our good ideas get traction?
What a terrific question.
Thank you, Karen. Good night.
I think you're absolutely right. We started with this idea of stories and data and the two being combined. And that is what I'm always looking for. How do I find a point that people care about, the people outside of remote areas care about, that they switch on and want to address the problem? For me, I talk a lot about food security because I've got an agricultural background. We're currently about to have a referendum on remote Indigenous communities, so Indigenous stories, but it is tying them to tying the sweet spot to what is it that people in the city care about. I saw a great post on LinkedIn this morning about national security and supply chains, you know, whether that be production, manufacturing or food. You know, telling stories about, you know, Landline does a great job about telling stories about remote places, but, you know, it is hard work, it's constant, there's never a silver bullet. Somebody said to me the other day, it's like a silver buckshot, you know, there's going to be, you've got to have a whole lot of people with the same message, telling it to a whole lot of people 1,000 times, and on the 1,000th time somebody says, that's a really good idea. Never heard that before. So it's hard work. It is being in the ear of every one of your representatives and making sure that when they go away with a very short list of what the priorities are. So I see lots and lots of advocates from right across Australia, and if I can't tell you what they asked of me, which is between 1 and 3 things, then that's been a wasted meeting. And there are groups that come with 20 and 30 points, all of them important and valuable, but you may as well have not bothered coming, because I can't then walk into the health minister at the lunch line and say, this is the only thing we should focus on. The only thing. And so, you know, to Sarah's point about community-led decision-making, community-led funding, community-led, you know, I think that is a terrific point, but it is keep it simple, make sure your community is briefing their local people, is being focused in what it is the priorities for this community, this region, right now. Don't worry about what's over the hill. Let's just fix today's problem today and then move on tomorrow's problem tomorrow, is my suggestion.
And could I add some colour to that excellent analysis from practical example? A Royal Flying Doctor Service is, of course, you know, more than 90 years old. We're very careful not to play in bipartisan politics or in partisan politics, but it's a mistake, I think, not to consider that everything that we do is one way or another political. The practical example I just wanted to illustrate, and Susan touched on it a little earlier. We were in the midst of the COVID crisis and our contract for Commonwealth Services was coming to an end. I think there was a broad-based recognition that we needed to continue services, and we went to the government with a proposal that said, essentially, listen, we've been in partnership with you as the Commonwealth Government, both sides of politics, for 60-odd years. We're probably going to be around a bit longer. Can we extend the life of our contract? And we sought a 10-year contract because we invest a lot in aircraft that have long lifespans and so on. Some of Susan's colleagues, Anne Rusden, who's she mentioned, David Gillespie, Mark Coulton and others, heard that message and understood that message and became champions in Canberra. And I don't think that's very different from the sort of championship that we have in local communities. Canberra, in fact, even after all this time, Canberra is filled with people who want to do good things. They're frustrated, they're trapped in troubled systems and all of that sort of stuff. It's filled with people, politicians on both sides of the house, public servants who want to do good things. And part of that storytelling I was talking about earlier and the data is helping them to do those good things. Clear message, simple ask, some confidence that the proposal that they're going to spend some of their political capital supporting might have a prospect of working and might have a prospect of making a difference. And I think we need to treat politicians more as our allies in this sort of community development process and less as a sort of adversarial point of, nobody likes to be bashed around the ears or ear bashed, or they want good ideas for good proposals that might work.
Lovely. That's a beautiful segue to our very last question. So it might be the hardest one. Brace yourself, people. Annabelle has a question.
And I get to have the microphone. Sorry. I didn't make the rule. It's a really, really simple question just to end on a note that reflects one of my dreams, if only we could. How do we go to that, to whichever part of government we're going to, and saying, hey guys, when you're talking about remote and very remote Australia, could we just lift that up, ignore all the jurisdictions, make one set of rules and get equitable access for everybody and just make this happen?
Is that a question?
I think we all just answer yes to that, don't we? I think one of the keys to doing that, Annabelle, and I know that's part of the program, is I think we have to have a conversation about what we mean when we say equitable access and what we mean when we say a minimum standard of care. And I think that has to be very concrete, because I think for any community, for any demographic or population group, we're actually able to say, okay, at a minimum, if you're out here farming our food and our fibre, or mining our minerals, or tending for our traditional lands, you should expect, as part of our social contract, that you will get at least this much care, whether that's a personal health plan or particular interventions. We can list that, and I think we haven't had a clear enough conversation about what that minimum standard of care is to then take step two and say, well, actually, here are the people who don't currently receive that standard of care.
Thank you. So, yes, there's some more. It might be a few people on the mic with this one, so it's going to be a lovely finale before you get to your, what is no doubt a delicious morning tea. Yes,
Yeah, I think it's the universal access. So if we use the international language, it's the universal access, but taking into account, really importantly, for what Susan has said, is we have to synthesise our ask so we don't make it impossible to achieve. If we give a long list of problems and a long list of solutions, nothing will happen. We'll paralyse the decision makers. We have to be prepared to be collaborative across disciplines, across professions, across services, across borders, to make sure that our universal access ask is clear and understandable.
Thank you. I think everyone wants to have a chat. Yeah. Oh, everyone that wants to make a comment, please.
I'm not sure if I am turned on. This is only very quick. I think most of Australia lives on the veranda, and yet I think most of Australia's heart lies in the centre. And I think we need to bring the heart in, and it's a topical thing to be saying at the moment, I know too, but we need to be starting to connect. I'm all for the data and the storytelling, but it needs to be heart to heart, not just all head based, because I think that's where we've got the ability to really look at making some changes, actually connecting human to human. Yeah.
I agree, and I think there's that emotive context, and I think we need to bring that in, because Australians like to identify with the rural heart, and it provides a sense of identity to who we are as Australians. But I think the remote, the context though, is important, because we're not. I don't think communities are necessarily well understood in terms of the communication and how remote Australia is marketed necessarily in terms of what those requirements are. So coming back to, I agree. I think something which is definitely going to be concise, something potentially is going to be measurable, in terms of evaluation, and so how do we reflect on that? So if we put something up and our politician and policy makers are actually engaged and are committed to it, how do we actually then come back and evaluate it, thinking about our data and everything that goes into it? Something that is definitely going to be achievable. Certainly we can, reach for the stars, but we'll be happy with the moon, that sort of thing. And to basically try and sort of look at the integrative way that we do it. So grassroots, community, co-design, multi-professional, and recognising all the strengths that everyone brings to the table. So I think that's really key.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to comment? You don't have to. We're just sort of doing the senators.
Yeah. I will say something now, because I feel like while I've finally I've got the mic.
What's your one last parting point that you
My
want everyone
one
to
last
leave
parting
with?
point is I really think that it would be great if some communities could get together under the RAM umbrella to, I guess, you know, for us, there was a lot of benefit with being able to be part of the story and the discussions at the National Rural Health Alliance conference and the RACGP conference and the ACRIM annual conference. And I just think it'd be so amazing to have a RAM stand at those conferences and allow any remote community who wanted to be involved to be able to get themselves a seat at some of those big health conferences and I guess become a part of the landscape. You know, it shouldn't just be large medical recruitment companies and pharmaceutical companies. I think it would be great to have remote Australians there. So I think that's something that I'd like to move forward. And it was amazing to listen to Dr. Farmer. I think universal healthcare, yeah, that's what we're talking about in remote areas. So.
Thank you so much. And Senator Susan?
I think I'm still on the same one about, you know, an ask that is, you know, measurable and with outcomes. I also think, how can we better connect with the other groups that Sarah's just identified, you know, the rural GPs, the ACRIM, all of these groups. How do we get everybody on board saying this is a fair and reasonable thing to do? So I think talking about universal healthcare is a great way to do that because that is reasonable. But otherwise what ends up happening is you end up competing for funding. You're setting up remote to be competing with rural, with regional, with outer urban, and you know, that's not a win for anybody. So I do like that idea of the universal healthcare as how do we identify something that then is measurable, and you can say, well, you know, are we achieving it remotely? And of course we're overachieving it in the cities, and so it makes a more easy decision-making process and you remove that competitive aspect.
Thank you so much. I see you are getting to morning tea, I
Have
promise.
the microphone. No, we need to break for smoko, but I would just like to say that the way we do that is we may well go to all of those things, but next year when we have this conference somewhere in Australia, let's get all of those people, and I know that some of you are here, but let's get really serious representation at the next RAM conference. Let's have smoko.
So it's a lovely segue. We are about to go to morning tea. I'm going to write up on one of these big bits of paper over here, who do you think we should be collaborating with? We'll put some pens over there. Any organisation that you think should be part of the RAMS conversation, we'd invite you to write their names up. I've got a couple of little things. So first of all, though, I think we need to give a huge round of applause to this panel. Thank you so much. It was inspiring and awesome information, and I know that there's going to be people who want to talk to you at morning tea. Anyone who's, so here's a bit of boring housekeeping. Anyone who's catching or booked to catch the Rex flight at 2 p.m, here's a remote Australia experience for you. It's delayed to 4:40. So it might be Annabelle Brayley ringing people and telling... She's been putting it out to the Universal Week, and I'm sorry. We've got you all day. Woo! So that's terrible news. Awful. Now, we're about to print the master list that includes everyone's emails. If you're somebody who does not want your emails shared with others, can you just go to the registration desk and let Karen know? And the other thing, I'm sorry I've got lots of messages here, but if you're not staying for dinner tonight, can you let Karen... Oh, wrong way round. If you are staying for dinner tonight, can you please let Karen know? We really don't want the kitchen to cook up 120 meals and have 50 people here. It's just, we've paid for them. It's not that. We just don't want to waste food. So if you don't want your email, you go to Karen. If you do want dinner, you go to Karen sometime during the break. So I think that I've included everything. We've got some gifts for our speakers. So if we head out to morning tea now, we're allowed, I think let's stay out there till, we'll do the full half hour. 20 minutes. Okay, so if we come back in at 10 past 11, you'll hear the music. I expect you to dance. Come back in and sit down. So thank you. Enjoy your morning tea. Thank you, guys. It was amazing.